I am now delighted to introduce you to the Lumen Achievement Award recipient of 2018, Dr. Ivan Rokos. Ivan, welcome to another Lumen Global. And
Samir, thank you. Good to be here.
sorry to know that the lower spine is acting up on you
A little bit,
Yes,
yes. But travels were very good. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. You have single-handedly transformed the STEMI process. Your award is purely to recognize that, and for the audience, which may find my statement intriguing about Dr. Rokos transforming the STEMI process, this statement becomes even more relevant when you realize that Dr. Rokos is not a cardiologist. He is an emergency room physician, and by including him on the major forums at Lumen Global, I want to continually emphasize that the STEMI is more about a process, less about the procedure.
Right.
Makes sense?
Absolutely. And actually, that was a brilliant thing. I remember when we came to that conclusion maybe 8-10 years ago. There's the procedure in the cath lab, the process outside the cath lab, and you really need them both to work seamlessly. And nothing's more frustrating than a great procedure and a slow process.
So take me first through the journey. How does a ER physician get to solve the STEMI process?
You know, Samir, it actually comes to me fairly easily, and I say that in a humble way because it's just what I deal with, meaning I'm not encumbered by the STEMI procedure. I cannot do the STEMI procedure. I have no skills inside the cath lab. My skills are all about outside the cath lab. And in that regard, an emergency physician is a perfect setup for this. And the only tool I have is the ECG, an electrocardiogram, and of course the patient history and physical. Those are my main tools. And so yes, at the end of the day, it came to us like, what if primary PCI is such a great procedure, how do we channel this and funnel all the patients that are appropriate to the front door of a cath lab for a STEMI procedure?
So historically, how did you start connecting the dots and get so involved in the pre-hospital care of the patients?
You know, going back a long way in history, I actually once was involved maybe around the year 2000 with a STEMI patient, and we had a cath lab that was down for the day, so I ended up giving TPA. And then TPA was so cumbersome that I advocated for something newer like Retaplace. And when the TPA company heard that I was doing that, or the local salesperson, they said, we have a new product called TNK, Tenecteplase, coming out. But the only way to do that is to get involved in a cardiac study. And so I got involved in various cardiac studies with the TIMI study group and the Duke Clinical Research. And that sort of got me launched into cardiology and clinical trials, which then gave me an avenue and an opening to follow what I think were the two very definitive studies, PROG-2 and DENAMI-2, where suddenly the cardiology community realized it's worth the wait to transfer somebody to primary PCI instead of just giving them on-site lytics. And at that point, that was the aha moment. So that was 2003. That's when the light bulb went off.
And then how did you translate it first into Los Angeles, then get involved with the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, get with the guidelines? I want the audience to listen to you because they need to understand there is a method to the way you have proceeded by increasing the stakeholders, by getting the societies involved.
Absolutely.
So talk to me about all of that.
And I would say, you did mention at the beginning single-handedly. I must correct you on that and say it's teamwork. It's teamwork. And
that's your humility.
But I'm very fortunate. I think, but it is true that we all work together on this. And for example, I was very fortunate early on when I had this idea to have another emergency physician mentor who happened to be the medical director of LA City Fire Department. And I said, should we do a study like DENAMI-2 or PROG-2? And he goes, no, we should just do it. Our fire department's ready. And at the same time, he and another emergency physician who was in charge of LA County Fire were able to secure a $3 million grant to get pre-hospital ECGs in LA County. And so that was a huge boost because you can't have a STEMI program without a pre-hospital EKG. It's absolutely fundamental to that absolute core. So in that sense, I had nothing to do with the $3 million going to the two big fire departments in Los Angeles. But when that was there, the pieces started to come into place. And then we had a very visionary leader that was in charge of the whole EMS ambulance system in LA County, over 10 million people, Dr. Bill Koenig, who again saw the logic in routing patients that were STEMI to a STEMI center and creating a STEMI network. And so in that way, LA, Los Angeles was one of the pioneers.
And how did you translate it to the rest of the country?
Then I got involved, well, we continue to have that vision. It's actually very scalable in a way. It became very scalable. The EKG became obviously a critical idea. We wanted to promote this as it evolved in LA County. We had dramatic success, and I was fortunate. Two things happened at the same time. One is I actually met Harlan Krumholtz, who at that time was launching the American College of Cardiology Door to Balloon Time Alliance. And he was also looking for some emergency physicians, so I got involved with that. And my favorite quote from that that I came up with during my lectures is, "It's not my door and your balloon, it's our door to balloon time." Absolutely, and that teamwork, I think it was absolutely wonderful. Emergency medicine and cardiology came together on this task. And then secondly, when we published our first paper on this in 2009, we showed a dramatic change from door to balloon times that were very slow, only half of them under 90%. And then as soon as we instituted this network, there was 95% rate of under 90 minutes. It was magical in that way.
Around the world, when I go and teach STEMI interventions, I often will tell them that if you wait to treat a STEMI patient till when he reaches the hospital, it's already too late. Correct?
Right. It's all about advanced, and we still struggle with this, by the way. We can get into this, but we, in terms of, we still struggle with making that diagnosis early, and that is one of the big challenges around the world.
So now you mention how you advanced pre-hospital care, pre-hospital EKG, and almost all of your work has required EMS.
Right.
There is no EMS in India.
Although we learned last year that the 108 number is evolving. So yes, there is some evolution of the ambulance system in India. But I found it particularly interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, but last year when we were at this conference, I remember that the first heart transplant was done here in Jaipur, just down the street from the hotel, and yet many of the ambulances didn't have an EKG on them.
Right.
So we're sort of doing advanced cardiology, we're missing first grade cardiology, the EKG, right.
So look into the camera and tell the Indian audience the importance of ambulances and show them the way how should they create an ambulance system.
Well, of course it takes money,
Right.
and that is not easy. That obviously is a government or private-public partnership as we've learned about. So money's important, and now you need to engage other stakeholders, such as government. But having learned about the 108 program, I think it's exciting that we now have vehicles that can transport. The question now, and what I've been thinking about ever since last year's Lumen conference on the long flights home, is how can we make the ECG available to everybody, first of all? And, as you know, I'm very passionate about this, we need to leapfrog technologically. If there's anywhere an EKG is showing a STEMI, it should immediately be set up in a cloud so that the people downstream at the hospital can see that and verify. Because as you know, Samir, we've been very fast. We're getting faster and faster, but we have issues with inappropriate activation. And that's an issue all over the world. We see a lot in Los Angeles County.
Ivan, we both collaborated on several publications with the Indian Heart Journal,
Right.
specifically talking about two aspects, which really cuts down to the chase of the issues in a massive country with massive population and infrastructural deficits like India. System delays
Right.
and lack of STEMI networks. Let's address both of them individually. Let's begin with STEMI networks. One of the reasons you don't have a STEMI network in India is because there is a lack of ambulances. I mean, that virtually breaks. How do you get around that?
Samir, I don't have an easy answer. I'll be honest with you. But I was
Every
encouraged by the 108.
every visit I have made to India, and I have proctored hundreds of physicians around the
Right.
country, that humility is profound. I understand it.
Right.
Exactly what you said. There is no easy answer, but
Right.
tell us some practical answers.
Right. And actually, just to jump back even farther back, starting with the patient, as we learned about patients, A, taking a long time to delay, and B, not necessarily trusting the ambulance service or not knowing about it. So I think that there has been progress made, but don't forget the ambulance is critically dependent on interaction with the patient, that the patient trusts that they can call this number. And if remember, the 108 number has some significance in the Indian country and Indian language, right?
Right, right.
It's reassuring as a number of hope.
But see, watch what's happening here, and let's try to make a difference. Let's try to intelligently deduce from it as so. The commonest thing what happens in India, the 2 or 3 scenarios which I'm sure Dr. Neeraj Bhalla is talking about, the dire situation in India, I'm sure he'll talk about it, is that the first option is you get chest pain. Fortunately, you recognize it early and you call and there is no ambulance available.
Right, right. That's
in which case now you say, okay, let me just whatever the family can provide the transportation, and they take a chance and try to reach, and but they often end up in an institution which has no expertise in taking care of these
or with
patients.
their family doctor, right? They find their family doctor.
Or that.
Right.
That's one. The second more typical scenario, which is happening more and more, is that this is the more educated, more affluent. They recognize the system, and either with or without the assistance of the general practitioner, they reach a hospital and the hospital sends the ambulance. But now you have a problem. You are going 2 times in traffic.
Right.
The bilateral, which we've experienced in other parts of the world also.
Right.
And the third situation, of course, is a centralized efficient system like a 108, which is fortunately making further progress. Plus, there are other similar agencies. In the United States, getting 911 together wasn't easy, as we've realized.
Right.
So here are these 3 or 4 typical scenarios. How to make progress, how to gain, what else could be done?
Right. And again, it is I would say it also does go back to the patient. Even in America, where we have this great 911 system, half of our STEMIs still come in by private auto and don't utilize the ambulance. So if you want me to dream a little bit, I would say if you have a device at home that could tell you're having a STEMI, that would be wonderful. Then the patient would know that this is pretty serious. And that's a little bit of a dreaming type thing, but you think about smartphone technology and wearables, maybe we'll get there in the next 10 years.
I'm wanting to go down another direction, a simpler direction. One of the gains which we had in the United States by creating, by doing all the STEMI work, your work included, was to create almost a national grid.
Right.
So that everybody knows this is a PCI institution, this is a referring institution.
Right.
Shouldn't that be a first step, that there should be a public dissemination, that everybody should know, look, this is the place to go for a heart attack?
Right. As you know, Samir, I'm passionate about maps. To me, it's how you define the anatomy. It's not a corner angiogram like inside the cath lab, it's about the anatomy of a region, and I'm absolutely passionate about that. And we have tried to do a little bit of mapping here in India. I've been working with the TCT-MD program. We've actually mapped over 3,000 hospitals around 50 different countries in the world, PCI centers. What we now have are 2 challenges. One is we'd like to connect the referral hospitals to help with that, but we haven't gotten to that stage technologically and through the budget there. And secondly, we have an issue with just literally finding addresses. Some countries are much easier to localize using Google than others. And so that is a challenge that we're working on, but it's fixable with latitude and longitude. So bottom line is, yes, that knowledge should be out there, what the STEMI centers are. The challenge, though, I think, going back to the patient, though, is most patients are not planning on having a heart attack. It's not like they're planning a vacation or where they're going to send their kids to school. It's a surprise thing to happen. And so it is challenging to get the word out to let patients know where they're supposed to go.
Now, all of that completely makes sense, no doubt. But in some ways, it also becomes a little more challenging, but also more opportunities arise out of it. That see, in the United States, we have virtually eliminated thrombolysis, or we are headed towards that, whereas in India, that is still the dominant therapy.
Right.
So now there is a role of not only necessarily trying to seek out a primary PCI center, but also getting access where pre-hospital thrombolysis could be given.
Right. I would say this, though. I would caution against pre-hospital thrombolysis. I see it potentially being done in a referral hospital with some knowledge about the pros and cons of it, right, patient identification. But I'd be hesitant. I think that's a big leapfrog to say you have an ambulance that doesn't even have an ECG. How are you going to ask them to decide who to give thrombolytics to? And you can really do a lot of harm. It's also fairly expensive, and it's a very big challenge, I think. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. And as you know, pre-hospital thrombolytics never really took off in the United States for a variety of reasons, complexity being one of them.
There's a remarkable physician I have encountered in Jaipur. You'll get a chance to meet with him tomorrow, Dr. Pankaj Anand. He's an intensivist. One of the challenges I've had amongst the many of trying to help STEMI interventions in India has been trying to convince the people, as you mentioned, teamwork, that there is a very particular role, a very defined role of emergency room physicians, intensivists, in addition to the paramedics. Now, this is, for whatever reason, there isn't such great patronage at the moment about the ED physicians into the participation in a STEMI network. How does one encourage that?
I think it's essential. And again, it goes back to the simple statement, it's my door, not my door in your balloon, but our door to balloon time. So I think the emergency physician is usually the first point of contact for a patient. We're also generally know more about EMS, the ambulances, than the cardiologists, which are often a little bit more remote because you don't interact with them on a daily basis. So I think that the emergency physician is very central. And again, if you go back, as you took me down my history over the last 10 to 15 years, because I could speak to a cardiologist on one hand and speak to a paramedic in emergency medical service on the other hand, I felt like I was a vital link between the two worlds. And that's, again, how it became so obvious to me that we had to put together regional STEMI networks. But yes, we should have emergency physicians at the table. The question is, how developed is emergency medicine here in
getting much better, and as nationwide also, as well as the role of the intensivist also. And I've always noted that we need them as soon as the patient steps into the hospital till he leaves out.
Right.
There is a big trend towards hospitalists also in India.
Right.
Take me to another important component, which I think, look, the aim of Lumen Global is to recognize the challenges of a particular country, in this case India, and make a difference.
Right.
One of the areas where I think the country can make a massive difference is the creation and education of the paramedics.
Right. Education is definitely important, and emergency physicians too. I think one of the many things that we do, first and foremost, we should be in charge of airway, breathing, circulation, managing shock, stabilizing patients. But shortly thereafter, ECG interpretation should be one of the top 5 tools an emergency physician
So by
has.
my doing this Lumen Global EKG STEMI EKG certification course, good step.
I think it's critically important. And we actually continue, I work at UCLA with the UCLA residents. It's something that we stress every day. You need to be very good at reading ECGs. That's essential. And so you have to also go back to what's a little bit of a challenge for emergency physicians. As opposed to, in general, a cardiologist, someone's already called and said, this is a STEMI. For us, we have, for every 100 chest pain patients we see, we need to find 2, 3, 4, only a couple of them are truly having a STEMI. So we need to efficiently filter through all these patients. And it goes back to an important focus of emergency physicians. And something I think it's good for the system ultimately is, we're about sensitivity. Can we find every single ECG consistent with an acute coronary occlusion? But we then need to work on specificity, avoiding inappropriate false positive activations. And that's where that interaction comes too. So I would say, as a cardiologist, if I say STEMI, your first instinct should be, well, prove it to me. And I should be able to show you an EKG. And honestly, that brings me back to the whole thing that I've been still working on and haven't finished this project is it needs to be digital. If a paramedic ECG is done anywhere, it should not be sitting in a little device. It should be in the cloud. So I can see it, you can see it, we can talk about it.
And act on it.
And act on it, exactly. And that's, if anything, if India is going to leapfrog its way, which it has every potential to do in terms of a STEMI system, that digital communication is critical. And that is one of my key beliefs when I come here to India.
Last topic to indulge you in, STEMI stakeholders.
Mm.
Who should be a part of a STEMI stakeholder?
A lot of people. A lot of people. I mean, first and foremost, it's about the team effort. So ambulances, feeling empowered, having the correct devices to diagnose these patients with STEMI, emergency physicians, cardiologists, the downstream folks, the hospitals, the intensivists, nurses, obviously. But then behind that, you need support of administration, insurance, and then we know that's important. And then beyond that, you just need patients to have knowledge. And that as you know, is a very challenging.
Right.
The patients are actually the hardest component of this all.
I call it actually that everything else you mentioned first is the low-hanging fruit. It is education of the patient,
Right.
which is possibly the hardest task.
Right.
For the audience, there is much to learn from Dr. Rokos. His presence to me at every Lumen meeting is my testimony to the role of what pre-hospital management is all about the role of teamwork. Ivan, congratulations again for your award. You have taught us much. You deserve the award richly, and let's continue the act and educate the Indian physicians as much as we can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good to be here. Thank you.